Why was one cabin still warm, while every other house in the valley had gone dark and silent? It is the winter of 1883. Somewhere in the high plains of Montana Territory, a blizzard has buried an entire frontier settlement under 3 feet of snow. The temperature outside has dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 Celsius. Wind is driving ice crystals sideways at 40 miles an hour. Every neighbor who laughed at the strange woman digging beneath her cabin floor is now burning their last chair leg to stay alive. And yet, one thin thread of smoke rises from a single chimney, steady and unhurried, as if the storm is merely inconvenient. This is not luck. This is not magic. This is the story of what one woman understood about the ground beneath her feet, and what the rest of the frontier had completely forgotten. If you ever wonder how people survive brutal winters with almost nothing, like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'll keep bringing you the lost engineering secrets of the American frontier. The morning after the great blizzard of January 1883, the men of the Harrow Creek settlement dug themselves out one by one. Elias Pruitt, the general store operator, found 3 of his window frames had buckled inward from the ice pressure. The Maddox brothers, who ran the saw operation 2 miles east, had burned through their entire winter-core wood in a single night and were still shivering at dawn. Reverend Cobbs later wrote in his personal journal, recovered decades later by a local historical society, that he had genuinely believed he would not survive to see morning. His cabin, built the standard way with a single central hearth and uninsulated log walls, had dropped to just 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius, inside by 3 in the morning. The fire was eating wood faster than he could feed it, and the cold was winning. But one cabin was different. At the far edge of the settlement, set slightly into the slope of a low hill, sat a modest structure belonging to a widow named Cecilia Drummond. Cecilia was 37 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, and had been homesteading alone since her husband's death from fever 2 years prior. By every measure the settlement understood, she should have been the most vulnerable person in Harrow Creek that night. She had no sons to haul extra wood. She had no neighbor close enough to share warmth with. She had, by most accounts, burned considerably less firewood than any other household in the valley that winter. And yet when Elias Pruitt trudged through 4-foot drifts to check on her, half expecting to find the worst, he found Cecilia Drummond seated at her small table, drinking coffee, with her dog asleep at her feet. The interior of her cabin registered, by Pruitt's later written account, as almost uncomfortably warm, as if a different season lived inside those walls. He asked her how. She smiled, set down her cup, and pointed at the floor. To understand what Cecilia had done, you need to understand what the Montana High Plains winter actually meant in 1883, not as a romantic inconvenience, but as a systematic, methodical killer. The region sits at an elevation between 3,400 and 4,200 feet above sea level. Arctic air masses from Canada descend through the eastern front of the Rockies, with almost nothing to slow them. Winter temperatures in January and February regularly plunge to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 Celsius, and during severe events, as in the blizzard that January, could drop another 8 to 12 degrees lower still. Wind chill values, though not formally calculated by settlers in those terms, would push the effective cold to minus 50 Fahrenheit or below, a temperature at which exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes, and at which standard building materials behave in deeply unpredictable ways. The settlers of Harrow Creek were not ignorant people. They were farmers, tradesmen, former soldiers, and second-generation immigrants who had survived hard winters before. But most of them had come from climates, the Ohio Valley, the mid-Atlantic states, even Scotland and Germany, where the cold, while serious, operated by different rules. In those regions, a well-fed fire in a central hearth could hold a single-room structure above freezing through most winter nights. The same strategy, applied to Montana territorial winter, was simply not adequate. The physics did not cooperate. A typical Harrow Creek cabin of the 1880s was built from green or semi-seasoned pine logs, notched and stacked, with mud and moss chinking between the courses. The floor was either bare-packed earth or rough-cut planks laid directly on the ground. The roof was a simple ridge-line structure covered with split shingles and, on better-built homes, a thin layer of sod on top. There was almost no insulation in the modern sense of the word, no dead airspace in the walls, no seal vapor barrier, no floor insulation whatsoever. The consequence was what engineers today would describe as massive thermal bridging and radiant floor loss. Heat generated by the central hearth rose immediately toward the ceiling, a phenomenon called convective stratification, leaving the lower third of the room, where humans actually lived and slept, significantly colder. Meanwhile, the uninsulated floor conducted cold directly from the frozen ground into the structure. Local oral accounts collected by the Montana Territorial Historical Association in the early 1900s describe frontier families sleeping with their feet pulled up off the floor even while their ceiling beams were warm enough to sweat. A standard cabin of this type consumed between a cord and a half of firewood per week during severe cold, roughly 128 to 192 cubic feet of split wood. For a single woman without a team of men to cut and haul, that consumption rate was functionally unsustainable. Cecilia Drummond, in her first winter alone, had nearly run out of wood by February. She had survived, barely, and she had spent the entire following spring and summer thinking very carefully about why and what she intended to do about it. The standard frontier cabin was not built to be warm. It was built to be fast. This distinction mattered enormously. It was one that most settlers either never recognized or chose to ignore in the urgency of establishing a homestead before the first frost. Speed of construction was the governing priority. A family arriving in Montana Territory in June needed 4 walls and a roof before October. Everything else, insulation, thermal mass, floor treatment, chimney geometry, was secondary at best and most often simply never considered at all. The central hearth system that dominated frontier construction in the American West of the 1870s and 1880s operated on a principle of direct radiant heat. A fire was built. It produced heat, and that heat radiated outward into the room. The logic was intuitive and, in moderate climates, reasonably effective, but it carried 3 fundamental thermal failures that became catastrophic in extreme cold. The first failure was floor loss. In a standard log cabin with a plank or dirt floor, the ground beneath the structure was frozen solid, a heat sink of almost unlimited capacity. Every BTU generated by the hearth that reached floor level was absorbed by the frozen earth and conducted away. Settlers compensated by burning more wood. The wood consumption increased. The cycle was self-defeating. The second failure was wall conductance, a log wall of 8 to 10 inches. Typical for a quickly built frontier structure, offered moderate resistance to heat transfer in mild cold. But at minus 20 Fahrenheit or below, the temperature differential across the wall, perhaps 70 degrees inside, minus 20 outside, created a driving force for heat loss that overwhelmed the modest insulation value of the logs. Mud chinking cracked in the cold and admitted drafts. A single gap of half an inch running the full length of a wall course could lose more heat than the central fire was producing. The third failure was convective loss through the chimney itself. A simple stone or clay chimney with no damper, common in quickly built frontier homes, drew air continuously from the cabin interior, pulling warm air up and out and replacing it with cold infiltration air from every crack and gap in the structure. Local historical records from territorial settlements suggest that many frontier hearths were, thermodynamically speaking, net losers, consuming more warm air than the fire itself could replace, particularly on windy nights when the draft effect intensified. Experienced builders in the settlement understood these problems in practical terms. Even if they lacked the engineering vocabulary to name them, their solution was unanimous. Burn more wood, sleep closer to the fire, and accept that winter meant suffering. It was simply the cost of frontier life. No one had seriously proposed an alternative until Cecilia Drummond started digging. Cecilia Drummond had not been trained as an engineer. She had been trained, as most women of her generation and class, to observe. Her father had been a quarryman in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a man who spent his working life reading stone, understanding how rock behaved under pressure, how it held and released temperature, how the earth beneath a hillside remained cool in summer and surprisingly mild in winter. As a child, Cecilia had spent hours in her father's root cellar, a simple excavation dug into the south-facing slope behind the family house. She remembered clearly how the cellar stayed at roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, in both July and August, and how in January, when the air outside dropped below zero, the cellar floor remained unfrozen, and the stored vegetables survived the season intact. She had not thought about this in any systematic way for 20 years. But the winter of 1882, her first winter alone at Harrow Creek, burning through its supply at a terrifying rate and waking to find her water bucket frozen solid 3 feet from the hearth, brought the memory back with sudden, clarifying force. The earth, she understood, was not the enemy. Below the frost line, roughly 3 to 4 feet down in that region of Montana, the ground maintained a temperature between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, a phenomenon driven by the thermal mass of the planet itself and the insulating effect of the soil above. The frost line was a ceiling, not a floor. Beneath it, a stable, moderate temperature existed through every season, regardless of what the air above was doing. What she began to reason, slowly, practically, turning the idea over through the spring and summer of 1882 like a stone in her hands, was this. If the frozen ground was stealing heat from her cabin above, then the unfrozen ground below the frost line was a reservoir of warmth she was not using. The cold was coming from above the surface. The warmth was waiting below it. She began watching the hill behind her cabin. She noticed how the snow melted earliest and slowest on the north-facing slope versus the south. She dug a series of small test holes at varying depths through April and May, recording the temperature of the soil with her hand, crude but directionally accurate. At 12 inches, the soil was still cold and damp. At 24 inches, noticeably less so. At 36 to 40 inches, the soil felt, even in April, consistently mild. She pushed a dry stick into the earth at 40 inches and left it for a week. It came out unchanged. The earth at that depth was not freezing. It had not frozen all winter. By June of 1882, Cecilia Drummond had a plan. It was not complicated. It did not require materials she did not have. It required only one thing that the rest of the settlement considered completely unreasonable: digging a room beneath her cabin floor and integrating it with a structure above in a way that would allow the stable ground temperature to buffer the interior against the cold above. She told no one. She simply began to dig. She started in the last week of June, when the ground had thawed deep enough to work without a pickaxe. Cecilia chose the northeast corner of her cabin's interior, a deliberate decision. The northeast quadrant sat furthest from prevailing southwest wind, which meant the soil on that side retained marginally more thermal stability through winter than the exposed southwest corner. It was also the corner furthest from her hearth, which meant any heat bleed from the firebox above would be additive rather than wasted. She had thought about this for months. Every choice had a reason. She began by pulling up 3 of the rough-cut floor planks. Beneath them was packed earth, dark and faintly damp, smelling of mineral cold even in late June. She marked out a rectangle on the ground, 6 feet long, 5 feet wide, modest, exactly as large as she needed and no larger, because she understood, instinctively if not scientifically, that a smaller enclosed space was easier to keep at stable temperature than a larger one. She dug with a short-handled spade, working in the mornings before the summer heat made the cabin interior stifling. The first 12 inches came out easily, loose topsoil mixed with ash and organic debris from the years the cabin had stood. Below that, the soil became denser and more clay-like, the color shifting from brown to a deep reddish-gray. This was the substrate her father would have recognized immediately. Compacted glacial till, the kind of ground that held its temperature like a cast iron skillet holds its heat, slowly, stubbornly, and for a very long time. By the middle of July, she had excavated to a depth of approximately 44 inches, just over 3.5 feet. At that depth, the soil temperature, tested by pressing her palm flat against the wall of the pit each morning, felt consistently mild. Not warm in any dramatic sense, but alive, unhurried, indifferent to the season above it. She lined the walls of the excavation with flat sandstone slabs sourced from the creek bed half a mile east, a material her father had taught her to respect. Sandstone is a sedimentary rock with moderate thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly, stores it efficiently, and releases it over a period of between 6 and 14 hours depending on thickness. She set the slabs dry without mortar, fitting them tightly by hand and filling gaps with tamp clay. The floor of the pit she left as bare compacted earth, a direct thermal connection to the ground below. For the ceiling of the underground room, she used 3 heavy pine logs laid across the opening, topped with 2 inches of clay and the original floor planks relaid above them. She cut a small access hatch, roughly 18 by 20 inches, fitted with a heavy plank lid that seated snugly in a clay daub frame. When closed, it was nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. A narrow clay-lined channel, roughly 4 inches in diameter, ran from the upper corner of the underground room diagonally upward to the cabin wall, terminating near the base of the hearth. This was her air exchange system, crude, unverifiable by any formal standard, but directionally sound. Cool, dense air from the ground room could migrate slowly toward a heat source above, drawing slightly warmer air downward in a gentle convective cycle. The entire project took her 11 weeks, working alone, mostly in the mornings. She told no one what she was building or why. When a neighbor woman named Ruth Albright stopped by in August and asked why there were stone chips and fresh clay soil piled near the cabin door, Cecilia told her she was improving her root storage, which was, in a limited sense, true. Ruth Albright nodded, looked at the pile of excavated earth, looked at Cecilia's callous hands, and said nothing further. But she mentioned it to her husband that evening, and by September, the settlement had formed an opinion. Before we show you what happened when the storm arrived, if you're finding this story as fascinating as we do, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Stories like Cecilia's are why this channel exists, and your support is the only reason we can keep finding them. The criticism arrived, as it usually does, from most experienced people in the room. Walter Albright, Ruth's husband and the closest thing Harrow Creek had to a master builder, having framed 4 of the settlement's sturdiest cabins, was the first to make his objections formal. He did not do so unkindly. Walter was a practical man, and practical men in frontier settlements understood that bad construction decisions had consequences that went beyond embarrassment. They got people killed. He stopped by Cecilia's cabin on a Saturday morning in late September, hat in hand, and asked if he might take a look at what she'd done to her floor. She showed him. He crouched at the hatch opening for a long moment, said nothing, then stood up and rubbed the back of his neck. "The weight of the logs above will shift," he said. "Come spring thaw, that clay floor is going to heave. You'll lose your whole cabin foundation on that corner." It was not an unreasonable concern. Frost heave, the expansion of water in soil as it freezes, was a genuine and destructive force in Montana construction. Buildings that did not account for it regularly developed cracked foundations, bowed walls, and in severe cases, structural failure. Walter had seen it happen. He was speaking from hard-won experience, and he believed what he was saying. Cecilia listened carefully. Then she explained that the excavation was below the local frost line, which she had determined empirically through her spring test holes. Below 36 inches in that soil type, she told him, the ground did not freeze. There was no water phase change to drive heave. The thermal stability that made the room useful in winter was the same stability that protected the structure from frost damage. Walter Albright stared at her for a moment. Then he put his hat back on. "That's a theory," he said. "Winter doesn't care about theories." He left politely, but the conversation he had with Elias Pruitt at the general store 3 days later was less measured. Pruitt later recorded the exchange in his account ledger margins, a habit he had of noting community events alongside his financial records. According to that account, Walter told him the Drummond widow had dug a hole under her cabin floor big enough to sleep in and seemed to believe it would keep her warmer. Pruitt's marginal note reads, "Seemed perfectly sensible otherwise. Worry she's been alone too long." Reverend Cobbs raised a different objection during a Sunday gathering in October. His concern was structural. A cavity beneath the floor, he argued, reduced the bearing capacity of the ground under the cabin's corner post. A heavy snow load on the roof, and Montana roofs received heavy snow loads, could cause that corner to sink or shift, compromising the entire frame. It was, again, not a foolish argument. Unlined, unsupported excavations beneath load-bearing structures were genuinely dangerous. What Reverend Cobbs had not considered, and what Cecilia had, was that the sandstone slab lining of the pit walls acted as a retaining system, distributing the vertical load from the corner post across the full surface area of the stone, rather than concentrating it on a single point of soft, disturbed soil. She had also packed a column of the excavated clay back into place directly beneath the corner post before relaying the floor, ensuring continuous load transferred to undisturbed ground. She explained this briefly when asked. The Reverend nodded slowly and said he would pray for a mild winter. The Maddox brothers, the saw operators, were less theological in their skepticism. Their objection was purely economic. Cecilia had spent 11 weeks digging and lining a hole instead of cutting and hauling firewood. By their calculation, she had perhaps 3/4 of a cord stored for the season. They had 4 full cords stacked and covered. They told anyone who would listen that the Drummond widow would be at their door begging wood by December. By late October, the settlement had collectively decided that Cecilia Drummond's underground room was either dangerous, delusional, or both. The first hard frost arrived on November 3rd. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, -10 Celsius, overnight. Every cabin in Harrow Creek lit their fires and began the long winter calculation of supply versus cold days remaining. Cecilia lit hers too, but she fed it considerably less than her neighbors expected. The storm that would settle every argument arrived on the night of January 11th, 1883. It came from the northwest, which was the worst possible direction, a full Arctic express pushing down the eastern face of the Rockies with no mountain barrier to break its energy. The barometric pressure at the Harrow Creek settlement dropped sharply through the afternoon. By dusk, the temperature had fallen from a daytime high of 8 degrees Fahrenheit to -14 Fahrenheit, -26 Celsius, before the snow had even started. When the snow came, it came horizontally, driven by winds that local oral accounts estimate at between 35 and 50 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0 within the first hour. By midnight, the temperature outside was -28 degrees Fahrenheit, -33 Celsius. In the standard cabins of Harrow Creek, this is what was happening. Walter Albright's cabin, the best-built structure in the settlement, with tight-fitted logs and a properly mortared stone chimney, was consuming wood at approximately 1 full armload every 40 minutes to maintain an interior temperature that hovered, by his later account, between 44 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 7 to 11 degrees Celsius, in the main living area. He was burning through his reserves at a rate he had not anticipated. By 3 in the morning, he was rationing. The Maddox brothers, despite their 4 cords of stored wood, had made a structural error that the blizzard now exposed. Their chimney ran up an exterior north wall rather than through the interior of the cabin. An exterior chimney, by design, lost most of its heat to the outside air before that heat could radiate into the living space. The flue was, in effect, a heating system for the Montana winter sky. They burned aggressively all night and still woke the frost on the interior walls. Reverend Cobbs, whose cabin was the smallest and oldest in the settlement, had his fire die at approximately 2 a.m. when a wind gust reversed the chimney draft and blew smoke back into the room. He spent 4 hours in near darkness, unable to relight the fire safely, wrapped in every piece of cloth he owned, with his interior temperature dropping toward 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius. He survived. He did not forget it. And Cecilia Drummond's cabin? By the account she gave to Elias Pruitt the following morning, in which he recorded in detail what historians now refer to as the Pruitt Settlement Journal, she had kept her fire at a modest, steady burn through the entire night, feeding it roughly 1 armload of wood every 90 minutes, compared to Walter Albright's 40-minute interval. Her total wood consumption for the 17-hour storm event was approximately 1/3 of a cord. The Maddox brothers burned nearly a full cord in the same period. Her interior temperature, measured by a small mercury thermometer she had acquired from a traveling goods supplier, never dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius, at floor level. At chest height, where convective heat from the fire accumulated, it remained between 64 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 to 20 Celsius. She had slept through the worst hours of the storm. Her dog had not moved from the floor. Here is what was physically happening beneath her feet. The underground room, 44 inches deep, walled in sandstone, floored in bare compacted earth, was operating as a passive thermal buffer. The ground at that depth maintained a temperature of approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius, regardless of conditions above. The air in the underground space, rather than being the minus 28 Fahrenheit air that was assaulting every other surface of the settlement, was sitting at nearly 50 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside environment. This was not heat being generated. It was simply heat being retained by 4,000 years of solar energy stored in 20 feet of glacial till. The sandstone slab walls of the pit were serving a secondary function. Through the day before the storm, while Cecilia kept a moderate fire, those stones had absorbed and stored radiant heat conducted downward to the floor above. When the storm hit and temperatures plunged, the sandstone released that stored heat slowly back into the underground space, a process called thermal flywheel effect, in which dense materials with high specific heat capacity smooth out temperature extremes by absorbing heat when available and releasing it when ambient temperatures drop. The sandstone walls were, in effect, a slow battery for warmth. The clay channel connecting the underground room to the base of the hearth allowed a gentle, passive convective exchange. Cool air from the ground room, denser than warm air, migrated slowly toward the heat source. Marginally warmer air from the hearth base displaced downward in return. The exchange was subtle, not a draft, not a measurable airflow, but enough to prevent the underground space from cooling below its ground-stabilized baseline, and enough to reduce the cold floor effect that was robbing heat from every other cabin in the settlement. The floor of Cecilia's cabin, the single surface that had been her greatest source of heat loss 2 winters before, was now her greatest thermal asset. At 6:30 in the morning, with the storm still howling and the temperature outside sitting at minus 24 Fahrenheit, Cecilia put a pot of water on the stove. It boiled in a reasonable amount of time. She fed her dog. She read for an hour by the window. When Elias Pruitt arrived at her door at 8:30, breath freezing into crystals before it left his lips, she opened the door in a single layer of clothing and invited him in for coffee. He stepped inside. He stood still for a moment, hat in hand, feeling the warmth settle around him like something physical. "Lord Almighty," he said. He had no other words. The story of what Cecilia Drummond had built spread through Harrow Creek before the snow had finished melting. Elias Pruitt was the first to begin adapting the idea, starting in March of 1883. Not an exact copy of Cecilia's design, but a simpler version. A partial excavation beneath the store's coldest corner, lined with fieldstone, left open to the interior air. He later noted in his journal that his winter with consumption the following season dropped by what he estimated as roughly 25 to 30%. He attributed this not to any single factor, but to the combined effect of the ground buffer and the changes he had made to his chimney system after watching Cecilia's setup more carefully. Walter Albright rebuilt his cabin's northeast foundation the following summer, excavating 18 inches below his existing floor level and relaying the base logs on a continuous sandstone footing that sat below the frost line. He never publicly credited Cecilia's design, but he also never again made a comment about theories in winter. The Maddox brothers relocated their chimney to an interior position within 2 years. By the winter of 1885, oral accounts collected by the Montana Territorial Historical Association suggest that at least 6 of the 14 permanent structures at Harrow Creek incorporated some element of subsurface thermal buffering or improved foundation depth inspired, directly or indirectly, by the approach Cecilia had developed alone, with a short-handled spade and 44 inches of determination. She was not celebrated for this. She was not written about in any territorial newspaper. The credit, where credit was noted at all, was diffuse and practical, the kind that spreads quietly through a community that needs to survive and does not have time for formal acknowledgement. But what Cecilia Drummond had understood, and what the builders and reverends and saw operators of Harrow Creek had not, was something that goes well beyond one Montana winter. She had understood that the ground is not inert. It is a thermal system of staggering scale, a body that absorbs solar energy over geological time, buffers it against seasonal extremes, and offers it back, steadily and without combustion, to anything intelligent enough to tap it. The frost line is not a barrier. It is a threshold. Below it, the Earth maintains a temperature that, while not warm in any comfortable sense, is dramatically warmer than the worst that any winter air can produce. The difference between minus 28 Fahrenheit above the surface and plus 48 Fahrenheit below It is not a curiosity. It is 76 degrees of free thermal advantage, available to anyone willing to dig for it. This principle, passive geothermal buffering through subsurface mass and thermal flywheel storage, is not primitive. It is not a relic of ignorance. It is physics. Measurable, reproducible, consistent physics that engineers today build entire passive house heating systems around, often without knowing that a widowed Pennsylvania quarryman's daughter worked it out by hand in the summer of 1882 with no training, no tools, and no one willing to believe her. Cecilia Drummond lived at Harrow Creek until 1901. Her cabin, according to a land survey conducted that year, was the only original structure in the settlement still standing without significant foundation repair. The underground room was described by the surveyor as sound and dry, with walls in good order. He noted it in his record as a root cellar. He did not ask why it was so warm. There are thousands of stories like this one buried in the margins of settlement journals, land surveys, and oral histories collected from communities that no longer exist. Stories of men and women who, facing impossible conditions with minimal resources, arrive at solutions that were not lucky guesses but careful observations. Engineering by another name, practiced by people who were never called engineers. They laughed at her. They rationed their wood and froze beside their fires and shook their heads at the strange woman digging beneath her floor. And then the blizzard came, and the thermometer read -28, and one cabin stayed warm while every other house in the valley went cold and silent. The ground had been offering that warmth the entire time. She was simply the only one who thought to ask for it. If this story changed the way you think about how our ancestors survived and what we've forgotten, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every week we uncover techniques like this one. Practical, proven, and almost completely lost to history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and let us know what forgotten survival technique would you like us to cover next. The frontier had answers to problems we're only beginning to ask again. This script is produced for educational and historical storytelling purposes. The engineering principles described reflect real thermodynamic phenomena. However, any structural excavation or subsurface construction should be evaluated by a qualified professional before implementation. This content does not substitute for engineering, building code, or safety guidance.